Good evening. It's 6 p.m. and we'll bring the September 28th meeting of the Anacortes Planning Commission to order. Taking roll. I believe Mr. Curtis has informed us he's unavailable. And Mr. Juretsky, has anybody heard from him? Okay, so we'll struggle along with the five of us. Let's see. You guys, has everybody had a chance to review the draft minutes? Any questions or additions? Nothing being heard, we'll approve those. Mr. Meismer, is there any correspondence or new business?
Mr. Chair, no correspondence other than that related to items on the agenda.
Thank you, sir. In that case, we will move forward to item E, old business, critical areas regulation amendments to address riparian management zones, Anacortes, chapter 1970.330. Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Planning Commission, those in the audience and at home. Just a little bit of brief history on why we're here. As a result of the Growth Management Hearings Board's finding, the city is required to address best management practices, best available science in determining stream buffers. And in so doing, we have consulted with consulting biologists and with the Washington State Department of Wildlife and the State Department of Commerce for agency review. And so, as you all will recall, staff came forward with a version 2 previously, and in that version we began the process of looking at stream buffers and corridors as riparian corridors and riparian management zones. And so through that process, once we submitted that to the Department of Commerce, they asked for a full 60-day review period, which of course they took into consideration, and staff began work with Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to, I'm going to call it, dial in those riparian management zone code sections. And so through that process, went back and forth for about a month. And so here we are today with version 3 of our riparian management zone concepts. I'll go through a PowerPoint here in just a second, but what you'll see is that we're using what's called a site potential tree height buffer. What that means is through WDFW, they have some mapping, and it shows in a certain area that site potential tree height, which might be in Anacortes anywhere from 90 to 150 feet. And so if we think about the Clyde Creek area on the skyline, then you might see a buffer that's 90 to 150 feet, but in our code, what we're proposing is not less than 100 feet, which is the minimum for water quality standards and cleaning that water that's coming off of concrete and pavement. And so as we start moving along in this, you'll see that there are some sections in there that talks about the riparian management zone and that there's no construction activity allowed with the exception of a few areas. So for instance, if you have a lot in Skyline that hasn't been built on, you would be able to have a permitted alteration for a single family residence or an addition that had a disturbance area not more than 2,800 square feet. You could still go 2 stories, but that ground area that's disturbed couldn't be more than 2,800 square feet. So having said all that, the other thing I would mention is that we are trying to get this to the City Council and get it completed by October 18th, which is the deadline that the Growth Management Hearings Board gave us. We could always ask for an extension if we need it, but I'm hoping that we have done our due diligence and can get this moved on. With that, I have a brief PowerPoint presentation I'd like to work through. So a couple of items you will also see in this version 3, a little bit of housekeeping here and there. And one of those housekeeping items is this particular section. And also, I'd just like to point out that the new wording is highlighted and underlined, and the proposed deleted sections are highlighted and crossed through. So the Growth Management Hearings Board indicated that we needed to reconsider our buffer with averaging, and so here we've considered that it should be not less than 75% of the area instead of 50%. That's consistent with what Evergreen Islands had appealed and consistent with the Growth Management Hearing Board's finding. And on to riparian management zones. That consists of the watercourse and the area adjacent to the watercourse. It is considered a critical area, a fish and wildlife habitat conservation area, and of course RMZ, short for riparian management zone. So the width of the RMZ is the height of the tallest 200-year-old site potential tree, STPH 200 or 100 feet, whichever is greater, measured horizontally from the watercourse. The RMZ may exceed that 200-year site potential tree based on whether or not it depends on the actual stream itself and the functions and value of that stream, essentially. And there are activities that may impact the RMZ, and that would require a critical areas report prepared by a qualified professional, would need to describe functions and values of the RMZ, and must include the 200-year site potential tree height. And then I've got a link here, which for some reason today that link wasn't working real well, so I'm going to work with WDFW to ensure that in fact it does. This is just a representation of what that riparian area, riparian management zone really is. You can see my pointer, there's your water course, and then from the dotted line, which is the high bank area, here up, this is a riparian management zone on both sides. And then just a couple of nice pictures in there. So activities that may impact the RMZ must provide a critical areas report prepared by a qualified professional, would show the 200-year site potential tree height, and they would have to use, of course, the WDFW mapping tools. And there are ways of calculating it using site scale data and soils information. That would also have to be provided, and then it would have to be sufficient in detail to allow a field delineation. And it must demonstrate that the project will result in no net loss of ecosystem functions for the RMZ and associated species. And again, the most common SPTH in Anacortes range 91 to 193 feet. As an example, Clyde River out in Skyline, 120 feet out there for the site potential tree height. Copied a few of the sections here for us. These are development standards for parcels containing an RMZ. So development standards containing an RMZ, and we've got the sections and the tables. It's a long-term goal of the city to restore the city's RMZs and to protect fish passage where scientifically justified. Here it talks about the watercourse, and development is prohibited within or over the watercourse except where it is the only possible way to provide access to a site. And so with that, what we're talking about is if there is a piece of property that's a platted lot, they need to access it. We can't just tell them they can't access their property, so they have to have a critical areas report. It has to be above, has to allow for fish passage, so typically it's like a bridge that they would be putting there. And of course the material would have to be durable, non-toxic. Untreated wood is, if using untreated wood is infeasible, wood treated with a certain, non-toxic material, which is the same that we use, by the way, for our shorelines. And in the watercourse, any action detrimental to habitat or actions affecting trees and vegetation is prohibited except for as provided above with the access elements. And again, all of that will require a critical areas report and assessment and mitigation necessary for any impacts. I think this is important for us to understand that while the site potential tree height becomes the actual buffer, which could be 125, 150 feet, there are allowances for folks who have existing developed lots and platted lots, as long as they follow the certain criteria, which is flow control for water quality, a maximum impervious surface of 35%, which is also in most of the zones the maximum allowable lot coverage. And then we talk about the watercourse ecological functions will be restored if they're harmful erosion, protects water quality and provides diverse habitat, results in greater protection of the watercourse, and any action detrimental to habitat and action affecting trees, vegetation, including but not limited to clearing or removal are prohibited except for as provided above for the access elements. And if the RMZ is degraded, and I'll try to put this in a little bit different language for us. So the idea is that if someone comes in, they have an existing developed lot, and I want to add on to that, then the maximum of disturbed area for that site could only be 2,800 square feet. I'd have to have a critical areas report. It would identify the existing function and values of that RMZ and what could be done to restore that riparian management zone, such as removing non-native vegetation, Himalayan blackberries, things like that, and restoring that, that actual riparian management zone to the best possible to provide for better habitat values. And of course, that would have to be monitored over a 5-year period. Here I've brought a little bit of information out from the table that would allow single-family residences and normal appurtenances, and this is where I was going with my last slide. And this is right out of our table in the critical areas ordinance called permitted alterations. And so with that, you still have to have your critical area report, but you have to follow this criteria as well. And so a normal appurtenance would be an addition as well. But again, that comes out with a maximum 2,800 square foot of disturbed area. And so if a person had a disturbed area and they wanted to do an addition and that disturbed area was around 4,000 square feet, then they'd have their critical area report describe how they can help restore some of that buffer so that their maximum disturbed area is 2,800 square foot. They might have to stop mowing some of the area that goes down to the water course, things like that. There's a small project waiver that would allow for the director to approve fences and rockeries and similar features or temporary disturbances for installation of utilities and things like that. But it would not contain an actual floor area, remove trees or native vegetation or block wildlife movement. And then there might be some mitigation necessary if you're installing a fence in an area and taking out some minimal vegetation for that fence installation. We've included definitions for the riparian management zone and site potential tree height, along with a link for the mapping. And all of this comes directly from WDFW, Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. All the definitions are directly from them. Watercourse from Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Got a few maps that our GIS department put together for us, and so these describe the streams within our city limits and number of empty lots and partially developed lots. Beaver Brook, you've got there over by D Avenue and 22nd is the bottom end of it. You've got 10 partial, 7 empty. Ace of Hearts, which comes off of H Avenue down to 32nd and gets piped, 8 and 16 partial. Happy Valley, that comes down off of up by St. Mary's, 20 empty lots total, partial 6. And again, those empty lots would be able to be developed. They would just have to abide by that maximum 2,800 square foot of disturbed area on the ground. Clyde River, that has 8 empty lots, 2 partially. Anacortes has 5. Those are out by Skyline, Anaco Beach Road. Cranberry off of Georgia, that comes out of the lake up above. And most of that, I'm going to say probably 80% of it is piped. Howard Creek, this is out by Sharps Corner. And this is volume 2 of the riparian ecosystem management recommendations is what the city staff worked with to develop these regulations in conjunction with WDFW. So with that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer those. If not, staff recommends opening up the public hearing and going from there.
Any questions or comments from the commissioners? Okay, we are going to go ahead and open the public hearing. I see no persons present in the room. Do we have anyone online?
Mr. Chair, we have one person online, but they do not have their hand raised.
Give them a second to decide or not. No request being heard or seen. We will close.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
If I may add a couple of short items. So the commissioners will find in their packet this evening a letter from the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife indicating that that the city has met, in fact, best available science in developing these regulations. You'll also find a letter from the Washington State Department of Commerce indicating the same. And you'll also find a letter from Evergreen Islands indicating their full support for the regulations. I'd also mention that you will find copies in your packet from Mr. Ian Muntz, who had some comments in regards to these regulations, and staff does not recommend any changes based on those comments.
So noted. Thank you. The public hearing closed. We will entertain any comments or items from the commission. So,
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
So that was going to be my question. I was going to ask for a summary of the 3 letters in support and then Mr. Muntz. I mean, the conversation, the discussions, the decisions that went into not considering anything that Mr. Muntz suggested, I would be interested if you have a few minutes to kind of summarize that.
So, one of the items that Mr. Muntz talks about is adaptive management. That's going to be decided in the courts. That was one of the items that Mr. Muntz brought forward to the Growth Management Hearings Board. The Growth Management Hearings Board basically denied that, and Mr. Muntz is now taking that to the courts. Mr. Muntz's opinion was that there was one section where we changed some wording, and in his opinion, he felt that that weakened the code. That language came directly from WDFW, and in our opinion, does not weaken the code. And I think that's pretty much what he had.
Thank you.
So having reviewed all the material, I think we've established the facts that this is mostly housekeeping at this point. The changes to the code have been agreed to by the state and by Evergreen Islands, and I don't know of any assenting opinions at this time.
Mr. Chair, I knew I read something about 35%, so I found it. It's attachment A, page 64. It says, any development, including but not limited to coverage by impervious surface, does not exceed 35% of the total lot area, and it goes on. So my question is just about how does that jive with the 2,800 square foot house example?
That's a very good question, Ms. Martin. Thank you. And so that corresponds with, first of all, our maximum lot coverage in the R2 use zone mostly. And so I think it works out just fine. 35% impervious area is something that we have been looking at a staff level now for some time. But in most cases, I don't think it's going to imbalance that 2,800 square foot versus the 35% lot coverage. I think 35% lot coverage, and I don't have my calculator here right now, but 35%, 7,500 square feet, I think you're going to be somewhere around 5,000 square foot lot coverage, and so 2,800 is going to be quite less.
Okay, so if I have a small lot, the 2,800 wouldn't apply. Which applies, the 35% or the 2,800?
Both. So we may have a lot, a previously developed lot where someone wants to do an addition, and they may have, it could come to a point where concrete sidewalks and concrete driveways and the house might not be 2,800 square foot, but might be more than 35% of the lot in impervious area. Probably rarely. I'm just going to try and calculate up a couple of things here for us.
So is your question, which one supersedes the other? Or?
Yeah.
My days of working as a planner, I was always under the
So the most, I'm sorry.
understanding. I don't know if you wanted to err,
So at the time, the most restrictive would apply?
I don't know. I've heard that if there's a code conflict, the most stringent code is the one that you should go with. So,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
everyone has messy codes. It just happens,
And that's typically how we
yeah.
work.
So I would say if like this happened, you'd go with whichever was more stringent, because nobody's going to argue with that in terms of an appeal or a ruling.
I mean, for an example, if we had a 10,000 square foot lot, 35% impervious would mean 3,500 square feet was the maximum. And so within that 3,500 square foot, you'd have to put your home plus any impervious driveway or anything else, right? Not to exceed that 35% limit. So I think the 2,800 is no more than, based on lot size,
Correct.
to include impervious driveways, sidewalks, et cetera.
That's correct.
Yeah.
The 2,800 is based on disturbance area. And so if I have a fresh lot with nothing on it, I go in, when I excavate for driveway, house, sidewalks, 2,800 square foot. That's it. So now, the thing about the impervious area is a 7,500 square foot lot's going to give you 2,625 square feet of impervious area allowable. But you can have another 200 square foot, say, of pervious concrete, for instance, and that would comply with the code. So that would get them up to the 2,800.
Okay, thank you. I think just the question in my mind as I was reading this is trying to find the balance between protecting our wonderful wildlife here and allowing a lot owner to build something that they want. It looks to me with the regulations that we lean toward protecting the wildlife versus being more lenient with a builder. And, I'm not arguing with that either, that just trying to figure out what is the balance.
And that's a very good point, Ms. Martin. And throughout this entire process, that's been the city's position, is how do we balance the rights of a property owner to develop their property and not create a taking. And so, in our conversations with WDFW, Department of Commerce, and Evergreen Islands, with our city attorney, I think we've achieved a really good balance here.
I appreciate your hard work.
I can attest to that. I think you, me, and Neil Strandberg spent a lot of time 6 years ago when we were developing our property to make sure we had the right ratio and the right mix, and we're pretty happy with the results. So thank you. And I think the deer that come through our property are happy as well.
Okay, any other questions, comments from commissioners? In case, I make a motion to recommend approval of the draft critical areas ordinance amendments to include the riparian management zone regulations to City Council.
Second.
Shall we have the roll call, please?
Ms.
Aye.
Martin? Ms. Ruther?
Aye.
Mr. McKenzie?
Yes.
Mr. Monalo?
Yes.
Mr. Graff?
Yes.
Motion carries. This will be referred to the City Council, and I think this will be timely.
Thank you.
Any last comments or questions for the council, for the commission? In that case, we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, commissioners.